I am so happy to have back on the podcast today Eric Wearne, Associate Professor in the Education Economics Center at Kennesaw State University in Georgia and Director of the National Hybrid Schools Project. Eric is the author of Defining Hybrid Homeschools in America, Little Platoons, that came out in 2020. His work has been widely published in both academic journals and in popular presses. He was previously provost at Holy Spirit College, associate professor of education foundations at Georgia Gwinnett College, and has a PhD in educational studies from Emory University, a master's in English education from the University of Georgia, and a BA in English from Florida State. Eric Wearne, welcome back to the Liberated Podcast.
Thanks, Kerry. It's great to see you as always.
It's great to see you. We have a lot to talk about. There's so many good things happening in the world of hybrid schools, micro schools, learning pods, all sorts of unconventional educational models. And you, of course, are very much at the forefront, not only in terms of research on these models, but in sort of explanations of what these are and why are families choosing them and what does the future hold. So I'm hoping we can talk all about that today. And maybe the place to start, Eric, is with sort of your most recent paper presentation just last week at the fourth annual Emerging School Models Conference at the Harvard Kennedy School, where you presented a paper there on hybrid schools. So maybe we could start with that and also what came out during that conversation and that panel, and then we'll talk about some of your other research.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, this is a new paper that it hasn't come out yet, but I spoke about it at Harvard last week, and we track these hybrid schools in all kinds of different ways. But one subset that I'm particularly personally interested in is the classical subset. This is a pretty big subset of the hybrid schools in general. And they've had a pretty interesting history, right? So if you think about classical education as one track and hybrid schooling as a separate track, they've had pretty similar histories over the past 30 or 40 years, right? So just really quickly, they were pretty underground, both of them, in the 80s and 90s. Around the turn of the millennium, the internet and social media kind of helped people come together. Then around 2010-ish, these membership groups kind of coalesced. Publishers became more interested in catering to these people. Homeschooling itself became a little more popular and socially acceptable, right? And then COVID happened, and that just accelerated everything, right? So this is true of both hybrid schools and classical education separately, and they kind of have just grown together exponentially since 2010 or so. So
And
what I was interested
Eric,
in,
Eric,
yeah,
sorry, can I just interrupt for one moment? Because it seems like maybe it's worth stepping back a minute and thinking about hybrid schools are sort of a structure
sure.
or an approach to education, whereas classical education is more like an educational philosophy. Is that how you would kind of separate those two things? And then see how they kind of come together in your research. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So hybrid
Okay.
schooling, generally this idea of schools where you meet fewer than 5 days per week, but the school is driving the instruction,
Yeah.
could be any kind of school. It could be Montessori, classical, project-based, STEM, anything, right?
Yeah.
And then the other track, classical education, could be hybrid, but it could be full out homeschooling. It could be 5 day schooling, right?
Right.
Right. So,
Right.
but there happens to be a lot of overlap between these two where we get a lot of classical hybrid schools.
And classical education, how would you define that particular philosophy and approach?
Yeah, I think I'll retell a sort of joke that a classical educator who's well known named Josh Gibbs gives, which is, if you ask someone who is deeply involved in classical education, they'll say something about grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Maybe they'll give you some definition in Latin if they're really fancy, but you might be better off asking like a student who's not involved in classical education. And if you ask that kid, what is classical education about? They'll say something like, it's stuff that's old, or stuff that it's the stuff that you're supposed to like, but you don't. Right. So classical schools typically involve, a defined canon of works that all the students have to go through. The teachers and students will talk about ideas like transcendence and truth, goodness, and beauty. And they'll have a kind of an overall school philosophy, right? It's not the case that classical teachers will shut the door and have their own kind of virtues and habits that they're teaching. It goes across the entire school.
Yeah, and most well, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah,
many classical schools are faith-based, but that's not a requirement. You could be a secular classical school. Is that right?
that's right. And that is actually one of the aspects that I was trying to get at in this paper,
Great.
right?
Okay.
So
Perfect.
you've got these three natures of a lot of these schools: the classical nature, the religious, usually Christian nature, and then the hybrid nature. So what I did was I surveyed a group of classical hybrid schools, and I broke them randomly into four groups, right? A control group, and then three arms that removed each of those aspects one at a time. So removed religion, and I asked, what would happen if would you be more or less likely to return to this school if it announced it would still be classical but no longer religious, right? Then what if it was religious but no longer classical?
Huh.
And what if it was announced that it would be a 5-day school, no longer hybrid, right? So by removing those one at a time, I can kind of get a sense of which one annoyed the respondents the most,
Mm.
right? So as it turns out, removing religion bothered them the most, right? That would made the respondents much less likely to return to these schools. Classical nature maybe had some effect, and as the director of the National Hybrid Schools Project, I'm a little sad to say the hybrid nature didn't really show much of a difference compared to the control group, but I think I have some ideas about that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are some of
Yeah.
your suspicions?
So, so that this is the question, right? If the parents are so willing to just give up the hybrid nature, why do these things exist at all?
Mm.
Why not just create a 5-day classical Christian school or something like this?
Which of
And
course exist, but
which they
we're seeing a
exist,
lot
right?
of growth in the hybrid space. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So what this is kind of signaling to me, I think, is that the hybrid nature lowers the entry barriers and the ongoing costs of these schools, right? Um, and it says to me that what the signal is that people care about sort of the identity of the school more than the structure itself. But the hybrid nature is allowing people to get the kinds of schools that they want,
Mm.
right? So I wonder if I sort of ask this same kind of question about other kinds of schools, not classical or Christian schools, right? About a STEM school or a self-directed school as the identity and place of religion, would people also care more about that other identity than the structure of the school? And I think they might.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
And then I wonder if in this paper, or certainly in your other work, you've looked at sort of who is choosing a hybrid school, and does that factor in? For example, if you have, homeschoolers, independent homeschoolers, at some point deciding that they want something more structured, but still retaining that kind of family identity as a homeschooling family, that they might be more likely to choose a hybrid school, and then versus someone who's coming from a conventional public or private school. I guess who is choosing these models?
Yeah, so this is a good question. That actually is a good segue to our annual report
Great.
that we just put out a few weeks ago. It used to be the case, certainly pre-COVID, that this was a very homeschool heavy crowd, right? So probably 2/3 at least would be homeschoolers that kind of came together because they wanted, more community, or they wanted their kids were getting older and they needed somebody to help them teach high school chemistry or something like that. Um, Lately, certainly since COVID, but it continues, is that you get more people who are choosing these hybrid schools and micro schools just as one of lots of options, right? So they might be coming from the 5-day private school down the street or the public school from down the street. So the mix is a lot more. It's a lot more mixed up than it had been, say, 5 or 10 years ago.
And do you have a sense of the growth in the sector, in the hybrid school sector specifically, particularly over the past 5 years? Do you have kind of concrete numbers?
Yeah. So our report, our annual survey goes out every year, and we like to track these things for this reason.
Yeah.
We just want to see how are the schools growing in size and number, and cost, and all these kinds of things. Um, so we will survey all the hybrid schools that we can find, right? So I can't say that it's necessarily a perfectly statistically perfect sample every year, but in our most recent survey, we found something like a quarter of the schools had been founded since 2020, and
Wow.
about 10% opened in fall of 24. So the pace is still going, right? We may plateau at some point, but I think we haven't hit that spot yet.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And why? What
Yeah.
is your, I guess, hypothesis of why there is this growth?
Yeah, I think we're still kind of in the early adopter phase, right? It doesn't
Really?
feel that way always for me, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I've been working with these schools and researching them for 15 years now. You've been around for a long time. A lot of your listeners have been doing this work for a long time. Um, but I visited some of my college friends recently, and we kind of keep up with each other, what we're doing at work. But I mean, guys don't really talk about particular things that you're doing at work all the time with friends that you don't see very often. We talk about Florida State football or whatever. Um, but they really had no idea about what was going on with hybrid schools and micro schools. So I think there's just still a huge market out there for to bring more people into this space. People who just aren't used to it yet. So, your listeners are kind of deep in the work, but I think there's a lot more room to grow here.
Yeah, and you also come at this topic not only as a professional researcher and academic, but also personally, in that you choose hybrid schooling for your family. I wonder if you can talk about why that was the path you chose to go for your own kids.
Yeah, sure. We started. My oldest two kids went to a perfectly fine 5-day normal public school. But we kept getting busier and busier. We kept having more kids, so we kind of circled this strange looking part-time school for about a year, before we decided to move my oldest two kids over, to it, because those were the only two who existed at that point. Um, and so it was a really hard transition for us. My
Hmm.
daughter who was very young, was fine. My older son hated it for a semester, um, and then after that, was like, I would never go back. It was the greatest move that we made. So all of my kids have been through there since then. That first one, who we made the switch with, has graduated from college. He's a perfectly fine, upstanding citizen. I've got another one in college now at a very different kind of college than he went to. But I think it helped us, have a more kind of more time together, first of all,
Hmm.
as the kids were growing up, and just less of a crazy pace of life, because they would be home doing their schoolwork 2 or 3 days a week. And it has turned out to be fine for them academically too.
Yeah, and have you found in your research sort of the average size? Because it seems to me that when I've interviewed hybrid homeschool founders or hybrid school founders, some of them can be quite large. In some cases, even operating two separate sections each week. So, say Monday, Wednesday, there's a cohort of over 100 kids, and then Tuesday, Thursday, there's another cohort of over 100 kids. They're often spanning K to 12 grade levels. Did you find any kind of similarities there in terms of numbers and structure?
Yeah, sure. So the average size in our survey is somewhere around 150 students. Um, Most of the schools are K through 8, in part because high school is just a more complicated animal, right? And that's a big hinge point, right? Kids, sometimes families want to leave because they want high school football or something like that that a lot of the small schools don't offer. So yeah, the average size is somewhere around 150 students. Um, some of the bigger one, but you're right, that masks a pretty wide range, right? So at our own school, we have something close to 600 students, but that happens with a session that runs Monday, Wednesday, and a different set of kids that runs Tuesday,
Mm,
Thursday. So if everyone showed up at the same time, they wouldn't all fit in the building, right? But the fact that we can keep it full all week helps us pay for it.
right.
Um, there are other versions, especially on the West Coast, that are charter schools that are above 1,000 students. So it just depends on kind of how you're set up.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if we could talk a little bit more about that, about some of the public charter schools that are running as hybrid schools, including some that have been around since the 1990s and that you've been following over that period of time. What are they like?
Yeah, so that, especially in California, that's kind of an interesting intersection of their
Mm,
homeschool and independent school laws and their charter school law.
yeah.
But there are schools that have been around, yeah, multiple sites for over 20 years doing this kind of thing. Um, and those are interesting because they often solve a problem that comes up with hybrid schools a lot, which is, what do you do if you're a family who can't just be at home with your kids 3 days a week, right? So some of these schools will run their normal classes 2 days a week or 3 days a week or whatever it is, but they'll stay open all five with maybe a crew of teachers who can help kids with their what's assigned as home day work, but they can be supervised at the school even though they're not
Hmm.
doing formal classes that day.
Hmm. And what is your sense of the distribution of secular versus faith-based hybrid schools? Is it, yeah, what's the
Yeah, pre-COVID, I
distribution?
would say it was something like 70-30 religious versus secular, but
Okay.
that's changed a lot since COVID. I don't know what the most recent numbers would be. It's still more religious than not. But there are tons of new secular schools opening up all the time. Like I said, we're all still kind of early adopters.
We're all, yeah, and that's why again your research is so important in this space. Yeah, and I guess maybe we could talk a little bit about one of the other papers that was presented at last week's Emerging School Models Conference at Harvard on the panel that you were on. And this was by your colleague Matthew Lee from Kennesaw State talking about who's teaching in these hybrid schools.
Yeah, Matt presented an interesting paper that we worked on, our whole group worked on together. So we did a survey a few years ago before this paper on hybrid school teachers, just to find out what they thought of this job and what their experiences were. And we found some interesting things like they tended to have less experience in a hybrid school. Sometimes that's because the hybrid school was just newer and they
Mm,
weren't used to that. They tended to make a lot less money compared to 5-day teachers. Part of that reason is a lot of the hybrid school teachers are part-timers, right? So what you get in hybrid schools, the teaching pool is typically four different buckets of teachers, right? You get um, people just starting out their career, and maybe they're trying to do something before they find that actual full-time job. You get maybe moms who have taught for a few years but don't want a full-time job anymore, but they like the idea of being at school with their kids, so they teach on the days that the kids are there. You get retirees who
mm,
can don't need a full-time salary, don't want to work a full-time schedule, and then you get people with just interesting jobs that have weird schedules, which thankfully is like an increasing percentage of the population, right? People can work from home some days and pop over to school and teach a math class or something, and then go back to their job, right? We also found in that first survey that hybrid school teachers tend to be really satisfied with their work.
mm,
And often that's because they would answer questions like, everybody at this school seems to be on the same page in terms of curriculum and instruction, right? Or they feel valued with what they're doing, which is I can't, that was in the high 90s. I don't think you could get a group of public school teachers to agree in the high 90s on anything, right?
mm,
But these
mm.
hybrid school teachers tend to like what they're doing, right? So in this new paper, what we did was we asked school leaders, um, who would you like to hire as a hybrid school teacher? And we went through a bunch of ways of asking this question. But one of the things that really stood out is even when they're not required to, they tend to like to hire people who have college degrees, right? Which I think that says something about, and we can talk about this, about all the tendency to try to layer more requirements on these new school models, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes you don't need to because the people are going to want to do certain things on their own, right?
Right.
So they want teachers with college degrees, but they don't necessarily value education degrees. What they want is somebody who has a bachelor's degree in some subject area, not necessarily education.
Yeah. It's just really great to hear that high levels of teacher satisfaction for folks working in these hybrid schools. I think that's also sort of anecdotally what I'm hearing from micro school founders across the country, which would include kind of hybrid school founders or those running homeschool collaboratives. It's just lots of employee satisfaction working in these new spaces.
Right.
Have you found at all, Eric, the impact of school choice policies on the development or acceleration of hybrid schools? Are there hybrid schools that are participating in school choice programs? I know you mentioned charter schools, which are, of course, schools of choice, but what about some of these private school choice policies that have been expanding through education savings accounts and other programs like that?
Yeah, so there are lots of schools of hybrid schools that will use things like their state tuition tax credit programs, where you can donate either individually or as a corporation to this sort of a fund that comes back out as scholarships to students. And then a lot of them are these new ESA programs are popping up all over the place. And yeah, there are schools that are finding value in these things because it's helping them get started in the first place. I think
Mm,
this part of being on the early adopter side of this is the people who exist now and have existed for 10 years did it without any kind of help like that, right? They just kind of did it on their own.
yeah.
Um, One of the big issues that we're going to start facing is a high demand for these schools, but less of a supply, right? So the supply side is an area that we need to do some work on, and I think these things like ESAs will be able to help with that.
So, of course, supply side is my passion. I love profiling entrepreneurs, creating these new models. What do you find are some of the ways in which new hybrid school founders get started? Any advice that you have, just based on your kind of 30,000 foot perch, to see what works and what doesn't? How could someone get one of these off the ground?
Yeah, a lot of these form in pretty similar. Like every story is unique, right? But they form in similar ways, right? Sometimes it's groups of homeschoolers that just kind of coalesce. Um, Whereas in the past they might have done something like a homeschool co-op, but instead they're like, no, we want to be more formal. We want this thing to last longer than just while my kids are here. So they kind of come together and start something up. But we are seeing more kind of individual entrepreneurs come together and just say, no, I'm gonna like put this whole thing on my back and start it. As far as advice, I would say maybe try not to just put the whole thing on your back, but find a founding group that you can work with, right? And then have a clear kind of identity for your school.
Yeah.
I think that's really the differentiation, right? That goes back to my classical schools paper. People aren't going to come just because you have like they don't care about innovation in the abstract. They care about, are you going to create a school that's going to serve some identity or some need that I have as a parent or as a community member?
Yeah, and that can be hard sometimes for an entrepreneur, not only an education entrepreneur, but an entrepreneur in any sector to sort of do this niche entrepreneurship, really leaning into who you are, not trying to be all things to all people, but
Right.
really be focused on what it is that you're providing and finding folks who also gravitate toward that. And classical education in particular, it seems to be one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing educational model, something that families all across the country are really excited about. So maybe that's why we're seeing such growth here too. Is that something that you found in your paper?
Yeah, I mean, I think the identity thing, but like you said, classical is not the only one, right?
Yeah.
I think there's things like this alpha school concept where they're just
Mhm.
like radically accelerating everything. I think might have some legs too. So that's another one. I think project-based stuff has been around for a long time, but uh, self-directed project-based schools I think are also another one that's going to have some legs. So
Mhm.
it's like I said, it's not just innovation in the abstract. Nobody cares about. What they care about is getting being part of something
Mm.
that speaks to their community or their personality or something like that.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. So, one of the other themes from last week's Emerging School Models Conference, it seemed to me, was accountability. How do we know that these emerging schools and spaces are teaching kids, that kids are learning, that in the case of taxpayer-funded school choice programs, that taxpayers are seeing some transparency there? What would you say?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I would say several things about this. It's really interesting. We at our very first national hybrid schools conference almost 5 years ago now, we had a panel that turned out to be the most popular panel that year, and it was on accreditation, which sounds like the most boring topic ever. But people were really interested because this question had started coming up. I think there's some inertia that pulls us back toward, like, well, how do we know, right? How are you going to prove it? And so I think there's lots of ways to look at this, right? I think it's important to push back against this tendency to say, well, we need to standardize all this stuff so we can measure it the same way, and we can tell, like, yes, you're doing well, no, you're not. I think part of that is um, from a just a bean counting and research perspective. It complicates my life that there's no single database that I can go to and look at how hybrid schools and micro schools are doing. But that's my problem, right? It's not the school's problem. And so one way we solve that is through doing survey work, right, where schools
Hmm.
get to sort of tell their own story, and we can learn what's actually happening on the ground. We're not trying to direct what's happening on the ground. So I think that's one really good way, is just to not to push back against the standardization, um,
Hmm.
and to hear from the schools themselves why these things are emerging. Because remember, nobody directed all this stuff to emerge, right? In fact, people didn't want it for the most part, right? Except the ones who were doing it, and suddenly it became popular. So I think we should trust that these founders and these families know what they're doing. Having said that, there is, as we're going to introduce public money to it, there's something that's not crazy to say, well, we should know what's happening here a little bit. So we could talk through things like maybe front end light touch accreditation is something to think about, right? Um, I don't know, or maybe I know some people really are against that too. But I think it's worth talking about a little bit, but we have to be careful about it. I think we could also learn from our charter school history, right? We've
Mm.
got lots of, I mean, we both have been around for a minute, Carrie. We've seen the charter school world kind of evolve over time. One thing that happened with charter schools, which were really, the idea was they were going to be really innovative.
Hmm.
Um, but over time, we decided, well, we need to keep hanging accountability onto them too. And it's kind of weighed that movement down a little bit. So I think we should be careful not to hold on too tightly to any of these things, but let the innovators innovate.
Yeah, I completely agree. What are you seeing from some of the hybrid schools that you've surveyed in terms of outcomes and data and metrics?
Yeah, so they're all over the place, right? Some of them will do kind of norm reference tests, which tells you a lot about your students, right? It's hard to say a lot about schools when you're serving 8 students, right, who are all in different grades, right? So I think trying to hang like formal accountability on that is pretty hard. But that's okay, right? They're not tracking it for us, they're tracking it for themselves. So some of them will do that. Some will do things like come up with different kinds of portfolios that they want to do, where that'll be either some, like, literally a portfolio of stuff that they've done, or it'll be some kind of event where they share all the stuff that the kids have worked on and created that doesn't fit into like a binder of things. So that's another one. Um, and then, yeah, schools are starting to get accredited in part because of state policies that are asking them to, right? So to access ESA funds, or to access, in Georgia, we have um, college funding that's kind of tied to accreditation. So they're all over the place. If they're charter schools, they're taking the state tests,
Mm.
um, right? Because that's a requirement too. So I think they're all over the place. Um, but that's why it's important to do things like quantitative surveys and qualitative interviews to find out what's really going on.
Yeah. And so, what are some of those pending research questions that you're excited about that might shape your research in the coming months?
Yeah, well, it'll be things like how do you want to be accredited? Why do you want to be accredited or not? How are you defining success for yourself?
Great.
Yeah, I mean, this really is kind of a really Wild West research space, but that's part of the fun of it.
Yeah. And, you said that these hybrid schooling models have been around for decades. The sort of first hybrid school networks, I know you wrote about in your book on hybrid schools started in kind of the early 1990s. Where do you see this movement going over the next couple of decades?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Like I said, I think we're still in kind of the early adopter phase for a lot of these things. Um, there's no reason for the pace to slow down, really, except that we need people who are willing to take it on. I think one of the interesting things that's going to happen, back to our charter school analogy, um, is that as some of these schools get a little bit of years on them, what's going to happen in terms of succession planning? What's going to
Mm.
happen when the founding group kind of ages out, right? Their kids
Hmm.
have gone through and they're ready to move on with their lives. I think a lot of schools will close, and I think that's perfectly healthy, right?
Yes.
What happens when a conventional school kind of loses its mojo is nothing. It just keeps getting worse, right? So some of these schools will close, and that's okay, right? Some of them won't, though. Some of them will kind of bring in. They'll coach up their bench and they'll bring in new people, and it'll serve
Hmm.
grandparents or grandkids and the next crop of students who come through the community. So I think that is one thing for the slightly more mature hybrid and micro schools to start thinking about if they haven't already, is what's going to happen next. Um,
Mm.
One thing that's going to determine the next 20 or 30 years, as you know, that is really impossible to predict is what is AI going to do to all of this stuff, right? So to the extent it frees up people's time, work from home already in 2015 or 2020 had kind of led to more of these schools opening. What happens when even more people can do that? I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, you were making me think of something too, Eric, when you were talking that, we do see the emergence of these micro school accelerator programs, incubator programs that will help a founder go from idea to launch in a matter of months and often provide kind of ongoing operational support. Many of those accelerator programs serve hybrid school founders or micro school founders and all kinds of different models. Are you seeing anything specifically in the hybrid school world around kind of a hybrid school accelerator program?
Yeah, there. I think I know some of the same ones that you do, and they
Yeah.
they have similar needs. Um, but this is something that we could do some work on
Mm.
because the supply side is going to need some coaching in terms of just like charter schools again. Lots of people have good education ideas, but you have to learn about budgeting and hiring and governance versus management responsibilities. So that is a lane that we need to be doing some work on.
Yeah, and then what about the growth of these networks of hybrid models? I know the university model, hybrid school program is particularly popular and it's been around for a long time. There's others as well. Are you seeing growth there too, where someone doesn't necessarily want to recreate the wheel? They want to join a network and a community that way. Is that also helping with supply?
Yeah, I know several groups that are working on how to kind of package what they're doing. Um,
Yeah.
it's tricky for them though because a lot of them don't have that background. They just kind of were people who fell into it, and it really, really worked. And now, what happens next? Um,
Yeah.
so it's a fun project for them all to be able to solve because they've got this thing that they love so much, and they want to help other people do it too.
So, Eric, you are working on all kinds of things, not only this research, but you also run a national hybrid schools conference, and you also run smaller regional conferences throughout the year. You have a lot on your plate. What is the best way for folks who are interested in this work and interested in your research and your conferences to learn more and get in touch?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways. Find us on Twitter. We're at KSU Hybrid, or you can look me up on Twitter, and I'll share all that stuff. Or we're the Coles College of Business at Kennesaw State. So colescollege.com/hybrid.
It's great. And I'll put a link in the show notes to the National Hybrid Schools Project and to also to your book, which I encourage everyone to read, all about hybrid schools. Seems like you're going to have another updated book, kind of post 2020 here, Eric, with the surge in interest in these models.
Yeah, I have some things in the works. I'll come back and
Wonderful.
tell you about them. Yeah,
Oh, good, good. I can't wait. Well, always great to talk with you, Eric Wearne. Thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
great. Thank you so much, Kerry.